Heath is from UNC Wilmington, and he's going to give us a talk of comparing Sellars' practical philosophy with Anscombe. So I'm really looking forward to this, and leave it to you, Heath. Thank you.
All right, well, let me try and share my screen here. There, is that it? Okay. All right. And Cracks in the Foundation, an Anscombean critique of Sellars' practical philosophy. Wilfrid Sellars is best known for his work on the theoretical side of philosophy during the mid-20th century, but he thought and wrote about practical topics too, hence this conference. At the same time, another well-known philosopher worked both sides of the philosophical fence, albeit with dramatically different starting points, style, and results. I refer to G.E.M. Anscombe. And as you can see, they really are very close contemporaries. It is my contention that her accounts of intention, intentional action, and practical reasoning are on the whole superior to the ones offered by Sellars, a philosopher who wanted to pursue practical philosophy in a Sellarsian vein would therefore do well to take account of some of Anscombe's insights. And let me add that depending on which aspect of Sellars you find attractive, you can sort of view the things I'm saying as friendly amendments, insightful commentary, or sharp critique. It kind of depends, you know, which part of Sellars you are approaching. All right. Here's a little overview of where I'll go. Points of disagreement between the two: the content of intentions. Connected to that is whether the expression of an intention has a truth value. What counts as a cogent argument in practical reasoning? What kinds of practical principles make sense? And what accounts for the intersubjective authority of hypothetical imperatives? That last one is not really Anscombe. That's more me inspired by Anscombe, but we'll include it. So first of all, Sellars on intention and its expression. One of Sellars' key insights is that intentions can be reasoned about. In this, he departed from, for example, Ayres and motivism. Sellars wanted to explore the logic of this reasoning. And the notations he invents differ slightly among his publications, but so far as possible, I'll stick with his latest relevant publication. His first step is to create a locution to express intentions. In English, he writes, I shall do X, and in regimented notation, he writes, shall, bracket, I do X. The expression of an intention is to be distinguished from the ascription of intentions. I shall do X, when sincere, expresses the mental state that I intend to do X describes. Sellars notes that we can also express intentions for states of affairs rather than actions. For instance, my intention that my children get a good education. To express these, his regimented locution is shall be, bracket, P. But since intentions are at least propensities to action, intentions that P imply and are ultimately grounded in intentions to do X. Sellars holds that intentions, and thus their regimented expressions, have no truth values. As a result, they cannot be externally negated. One can write shall, bracket, I don't do X, but you can't write not the case that shall, I do X. Moreover, shall expressions cannot be constituents in larger expressions. There is such a thing as shall P and Q, but no shall P and shall Q. One can see what motivates Sellars here. Shall is supposed to express intentions, and it is distinctly unclear what any logically more complex expression would express. All this means that, according to Sellars, statements like, I will fail the exam, or my children will inherit a small fortune, are systematically ambiguous. As predictions, they have a truth value. That is, if I'm predicting whether I'm going to fail the exam or my children are going to inherit, that could be true or false. My prediction could be true or false. But if I'm intending these things, they don't have a truth value, therefore the content is different. And this difference is reflected in Sellars' notation. That's why it's part of the reason he invents the notation. So if we compare Anscombe, Anscombe begins her famous little book, Intention, where Sellars does, with intentions and their expression. That's actually where she starts the book, but she finds that a dead end. And so she turns instead to an account of intentional actions. Her argument is tortuous and obscure, infamously. But to summarize, she defines an intentional action in epistemic terms as one where the agent knows without observation what she is doing and why. A description of an intentional action is just a plain descriptive statement. I am writing a letter, or I am giving a talk, for example. The writing of the letter is an intentional action, according to Anscombe, just in case the agent doing the writing knows she is writing the letter, knows what reason she has for writing it, and knows all this without having to engage in empirical observation to discover it. The contrast is with, for example, discovering that you are unintentionally ruining the surface of your desk as the ink bleeds through the paper. For Anscombe, an expression of intention is just a statement of what intentional action I will do in the future. For example, I will write a letter. The philosophical interest of such statements lies in distinguishing them from what Anscombe calls, early in her book, quote, an estimate of my chances. Following Wittgenstein, she explores the idea that expressions of intention are, in fact, a species of prediction. She drops the subject inconclusively because the issue turns on taxonomic choices about which she has little interest. Roughly, do you want to call it a belief or not? And I think she's just not really interested in that taxonomic question. She is clear, however, that expressions of intention have exactly the truth values they seem to. When I say, I will write a letter, my statement is true, if and only if, at some time in the future, I do write a letter. Whether expressions of intentions are predictions, and thus whether intentions are beliefs, Anscombe does not settle. That's that taxonomic question she just leaves aside. She is clear, though, as her definition of intentional action might have brought out, that intentions that one succeeds in acting on are a species of knowledge, what she calls, following Aristotle and Aquinas, practical knowledge. The idea, crudely, is this. My mental state is true if and only if it corresponds to the world. This state constitutes knowledge if it is justified or reliable or non-accidental. Pick your favorite definition of knowledge. There are two ways this could be achieved. I could justifiably or reliably or non-accidentally detect how the world is and conform my mental state to it. This is contemplative knowledge. Or I could justifiably or reliably or non-accidentally change the world to conform to my mind, and this yields practical knowledge. The reasons that would bear on an ordinary belief about the future would be those having to do with its likelihood of being true. Thus, a properly functioning ordinary belief is sensitive to evidence. The reasons that would bear on an intention, however, would be those having to do with whether it was a good idea to make true, whether it conformed my values or helped fulfill my purposes, and so on. Thus, a properly functioning intention motivates action, since it is supposed to be part of a process of effecting changes in the world. Consequently, these different states go wrong in different ways. Now we are speaking of direction of fit. If the ordinary belief's content is false, this reflects a mistake about the world, while if the intention's content is false, it reflects a mistake or failure in bringing about the intended result. All these differences derive from the fundamental difference in justification in terms of theoretical versus practical reasons. The fundamental difference between an ordinary belief about the future and an intention is not in the content of the attitude or its truth value, but in what gives one reasons to hold it. The expression of an intention is identical to the expression of an ordinary belief about the future, and they have the same content. Anscombe agrees that both actions and states of affairs can be objects of intention. The explanation is relatively straightforward. Affecting the world to match the content of my intention will definitionally involve an intentional action. And so intentions to do such and such will be the last item in chains of reasoning and the first in execution. Thus, intentions that do imply intentions to, and in some sense, intentions to are fundamental. On this score, Sellars and Anscombe concur. Sellars takes for granted that intentions and beliefs are sharply distinct. For Anscombe, the distinction is real but extrinsic. The difference lies in what kind of reasons support them. Her view can be given some support by considering cases where the difference between an intention and an ordinary belief about the future is unclear. Consider first the claim, I will pay off my mortgage before I retire. This is eminently predictable due to my age, the security of my job, direct deposit of my paycheck, direct withdrawal of my mortgage payment, and the balance on my mortgage. If you were going to be betting on this, it would be a very good bet. It's also something I happen to think is a good idea, and I plan on doing it. So this claim has both theoretical and practical justification, and it seems to me indeterminate between an expression of belief and an expression of intention. It's just, when I say that, it just seems unclear to me and not particularly useful to parse whether I'm expressing a belief or expressing an intention. Consider second, a claim for which I have no evidence at all and total inability to bring about. My grandchildren will walk on Mars. There is no mental trail of justificatory breadcrumbs to follow, and I just put it out there to make a philosophical point in this paper. Such a claim has neither theoretical nor practical justification, and again, it seems to me indeterminate between an ordinary prediction and an expression of intention. Finally, consider the example Anscombe deploys against views like Sellars. In the presence of a nurse, a doctor says to a patient, "Nurse will take you to the operating room now." Anscombe points out that this one utterance simultaneously functions to express the intention of the doctor, inform the patient, and give an order to the nurse. We would ordinarily say that the doctor expressed his intention, and in light of the relevant authority relations, that is why the nurse received an order. We would also say that the patient knew where he was going, and he knew it by testimony rather than inference. That is, I think if the doctor says that in front of the patient, he's telling the patient where he's going, the patient is not going through an inference like, oh, the doctor expressed an intention that the nurse take me to the operating room and she's probably going to follow that order, therefore I'm going to wind up in the operating room. No, the doctor just told you where you were going. There's no clean distinction between the expressions of belief, whose function is to describe, and expressions of intention with some other function. Now, if intention and ordinary belief were two intrinsically different kinds of mental state, one of which stood behind each sincere utterance of a future tense indicative statement, these indeterminacies would be impossible. But if intention and ordinary belief are distinguished by an extrinsic property, namely the type of reasons that support them, then we can imagine cases like these where the distinction is not sharp. Thus, when representing intentions for logical purposes, Anscombe does not mark them with any special notation. The expression of an intention is simply an ordinary future tense indicative statement. It also has a truth value. The same truth value that the corresponding ordinary belief about the future would have. As such, there is no problem combining expressions of intention in larger logical complexes. I will run a marathon and then I will throw up is true if and only if both its conjuncts are true, okay? And its meaning is a compositional function of its parts. Anscombe's views hew closer to common sense. The ordinary way of expressing one's intention is indeed a future tense indicative statement. Such expressions combine in ordinary English with descriptive language. So, for example, I will run a marathon and then throw up, okay? The first part is, there's an intention behind it, and the throwing up is non-intentional. but there's no problem combining them, as there is on Sellars' view. Furthermore, the ordinary tests for truth values apply to expressions of intention. For example, if I say, I will run a marathon, and you say correctly, no, you won't, okay, you seem to be contradicting me. However, what you've expressed is a belief, whereas what I expressed was an intention. After all, I'm hardly in a position to reply, you're right, without abandoning my prior commitment, although Sellars analyzes my first comment as expressing an intention and my second as expressing a belief. More supportively, you might say, I believe what you say, which is impossible unless I expressed a proposition in the first case. Okay. Now, I'm not going to say that these problems are sort of insurmountable. You know, there are logics trying to combine intentions and plans, Gibbard stuff with plans and things. I'm just going to say it's really hard and really technical. And as far as Anscombe is concerned, you don't need to do any of that business. Okay. When you say, I will run a marathon, you're just making a claim about the future. The content is exactly what it looks like. It combines exactly the way you think it does. And what's unique about it is not anything about the content, but simply the sorts of reasons that are behind it. Now, all of this, it's unclear, I think, how deep these errors cut. Possibly they are, one might say, merely technical. And serious philosophical insights might survive them, possibly not. The next section will detail more substantive problems. So here we get Sellars on practical reasoning. Sellars develops a notation for intentions because he's interested in developing a logic for practical reasoning. Regardless of how he characterizes the premises and conclusions of this reasoning, the notation, for example, what the premises and conclusions are like, what can we say about the inferences? In Sellars' view, the logic of intentions calls for very few innovations. His main rule of inference for intentions, S-imp, okay, this first rule up here, if P implies Q, then it shall be the case that P implies it shall be the case that Q. It follows that all the valid patterns of classical logic have an analog in Sellars' logic of intentions as well. Sellars explains, it is because of this dimension that the logic of purposes and values is largely derivative from the logic of facts. And I'll come to this, so be it here momentarily, but we'll come back. As an inference principle for intentions, S-imp fails on two counts, unless we are using the word intention stipulatively. First, I don't need to intend everything my intentions imply. For example, if I declare my intention to meet you tomorrow morning for coffee, for example, by saying, I will meet you for coffee in the morning, this implies that the sun will rise tomorrow. That's the only way there's a morning. But that is not the content of any intention of mine. I don't have to intend that. But notice, I do have to intend that under S-imp, right? Second, common sense recognizes a distinction between intended effects and merely foreseen side effects. Suppose I'm on my way to meet you for coffee by way of a trolley, which mid-trip goes loco. I see it bearing down on 5 helpless strangers, but I can switch the trolley onto a spur where it will hit and kill 1 helpless stranger. You're familiar with this problem, I assume. I switch tracks, intentionally save the 5, and non-intentionally kill the 1, or so common sense tells us. On the other hand, S-imp rules it out. If switching tracks implies killing the 1, again, here we go. If switching tracks implies killing the 1, then an intention to switch tracks implies an intention to kill the 1. Getting this kind of thing right was important to Anscombe. She's famous for advocating for the intention-foresight distinction. It's also important to articulating a certain kind of moral prohibition. For example, many people believe you should never murder anyone, which is to say you should never intentionally kill an innocent person. But if intentionally just means foreseeably, or even implied by other things I intend plus background conditions, then our trolley driver murders the 1 helpless victim when he switches tracks. Since everyone thinks you ought to switch tracks, we would have to give up the prohibition on murder. and it is not clear what Sellars could offer in its place. Note that this objection does not turn on the truth of this moral prohibition against murdering, nor on its exceptionlessness. You have a prima facie duty not to murder would raise all the same issues. The objection turns rather on the conceptual possibility of framing the prohibition or anything like it. It's just not clear how to do that under Sellars' approach. And if we can't do that, I think we have lost something essential to moral thinking, and S-imp is the culprit. All right. Now, Sellars, in effect, doubles down with a second relevant inference principle, so be it. And we'll go back here. Shall be phi, and P implies shall be phi and P. And this has the effect of packing all the facts, all the background conditions into the contents of my intention. So once we have that, we can use S-imp to use all the ordinary inference patterns, but with intentions and beliefs. As Sellars writes, implications conforming to this principle push in the direction of getting relevant beliefs into the scope of our purposes and intentions. So the idea, again, is to just sort of pack all of our beliefs into what we count as an intention. So be it has much the same sort of effect as S-imp, eliding distinctions between intention contents and their causes, conditions, side effects, and background knowledge. That all just sort of gets mushed together if you're Sellars. But there is a method to this madness. Sellars conceives of choices as simply the comparison of alternatives, and the alternatives are understood as states of the world. It is a consequentialist way of understanding choices, where the only morally relevant aspect of an action is its effects. Indeed, Sellars is simply borrowing his peculiar understanding of intentions from well-known consequentialists. Sidgwick, for example, articulated a view of intentional action on which the difference between intended and merely foreseen consequences was unintelligible. And so here's this quote. Moralists of all schools, I conceive, would agree that the moral judgments which we pass on actions relate primarily to intentional actions regarded as intentional. In other words, he goes on, and this is the squirrely part, the effects which he foresaw in willing the act, or more strictly, his volition or choice of realizing the effects as foreseen. So if you do that, obviously, the distinction between foresight and intention has totally collapsed. In evaluating Sellars' logic of intentions, or at this point, intentions, right? Scare quote, intentions, we should be aware that it is not a logic for practical reasoning as ordinarily understood and widely conceived, nor is it neutral between various competing paradigms of ethical thinking. Rather, the fundamental structure of consequentialism has been built in. All right. So here's Anscombe on practical reasoning. What is the distinction between practical and theoretical reasoning? Sellars' view is that practical reasoning operates on different items, namely intentions. Its form, however, is the same as that of theoretical reasoning, as S-imp shows. Here, Sellars is in the same boat with a number of contemporaries, among them Hare, Castaneda, and Ohm. Anscombe's view is roughly the reverse. The premises and conclusions of practical reasoning are ordinary claims about, especially, what will be the case. The form of this reasoning, however, what counts as a cogent argument, differs. The difference traces back to the difference between contemplative and practical knowledge. The justification of contemplative knowledge requires reasons which show some proposition to be true. And ideally, this connection amounts to a deductively valid proof. Practical knowledge, on the other hand, requires reasons which show some state of the world to be a good idea or worth making true, attractive. This might amount to some action being rationally required, or rationally required given some objectives or constraints, etc. But that case is fairly rare. Generally speaking, there are a lot of ways to accomplish one's objectives. That doesn't mean that the decision to take one of those ways is irrational or requires no thought. Suppose a bodybuilder is on a diet regimen that requires a certain amount of protein per day, and she is 30 grams short of her goal for the day at dinner time. She can eat several eggs or a steak or have yogurt or soybeans or drink a protein shake or several other options or combinations of these options. Anscombe thinks of reasoning like this as perfectly fine and a perfectly ordinary example of reasoning. I will eat 30 grams of protein for dinner. This steak has 30 grams of protein, so I will eat this steak. Now, obviously, this is not deductively valid reasoning. Okay, you would fail your logic test if you provided this as an example of a valid argument. In fact, if practical reasoning had the same form as theoretical reasoning, this bit would be fallacious. In fact, there's nothing fallacious about it, Anscombe holds, and that just goes to show that the two kinds of reasoning have different forms. A lot of practical life is like this. Maybe I want to keep reading serious fiction. That means I have to read some serious fiction. I'm hardly going to read all of it. But it does not mean I have to read every piece of serious fiction I come across, nor does it require that there be some decision procedure for which pieces of serious fiction I read. One can imagine some attempts to save Sellars' parallelism between practical and theoretical reasoning. One attempt is to say that, hey, a lot of theoretical reasoning is non-deductive, so it doesn't harm the parallelism to point out the non-deductive nature of practical reasoning. But this ignores that practical reasoning, at least as Anscombe conceives it, is not merely non-deductive, but is in fact the reverse of deductive. What follows deductively from a premise is a necessary condition. What is a good means to a given end, on the other hand, is a sufficient condition. A deductive inference moves from particular claims, like I will read Gravity's Rainbow, to existential claims, I will read some serious fiction. While specifying a specific means to a general end moves in the opposite direction, as in the example on the slide. This is because practical reasoning is not an attempt to discover truths, it is an attempt to create them. Another attempt to salvage the parallelism is to say that what follows from an intention, strictly speaking, really is given by deductively valid reasoning. For example, maybe our bodybuilder is only able to conclude something like, I will have this steak or these eggs or this yogurt or that protein shake or blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then the choice of these among these alternatives is viewed as some kind of existentialist arbitrary leap. Okay. But as a representation of any agent's actual reasoning, however, this is a pretty big stretch. Nobody actually forms those big, long, disjunctive conclusions. And aside from being an implausible account of anyone's thought life, it doesn't count as reasoning all those mental steps from ends to means that people actually do take, like in the example. Moreover, I don't even know how one would go about listing to oneself all the possibilities for example, reading serious fiction. There's just too many damn books. That there are ordinarily several ways to skin a cat, and that choosing among them is practical reasoning is a piece of common sense that Sellars' view of practical reasoning denies. This odd consequence is obscured at least partly again by his sub rosa consequentialism. That connection will come out more clearly in the next section. One more remark is in order before leaving this topic. The conclusion, I will have this steak for dinner, entails a cow will have died for my dinner. Now, on Sellars' view of practical reasoning, this latter proposition is intended, or intended as packed into my larger intention, precisely because it is entailed. On Anscombe's competing view, that a cow will have died for her dinner is not an object of the bodybuilder's intention because it does not satisfy any of her aims or purposes. I mean, I suppose you could have a particularly bloodthirsty bodybuilder, but they're not common. She might well take this consequence to be an overridden reason against eating steak. You might say that's not a reason to do it, but it happens and that's just the way it goes. So the difference between Sellars and Anscombe on the structure of practical reasoning ramifies into their difference about which actions are intentional. And on both counts, Anscombe's account looks more plausible, to me anyway. All right. Lastly, Sellars on the authority of hypothetical imperatives. More than once in his Sellars uses the parable of Smith, who is faced with a heavy object, a stone, and a steel rod. That's him on the left. Smith is evidently rather dense, but fortunately, he is assisted by a team of scientists, yes, an entire team, who conclude that the only way to lift the object is to lever it up with the rod, using the stone as a fulcrum. They express this conclusion as, if Smith wants to raise the object, he ought to use the rod as a lever. Sellars gets several things right about this example. First, wants is misleading. What are really logically related here are the actions and thus the intentions of Smith raising the object and Smith using the rod as a lever. Second, ought is misleading. Since the relation is one of necessity, the better modal word is must. Finally, the consequent does not detach with modus ponens. That is, we cannot conclude from the fact that Smith wants or intends to raise the object that he ought to or must use the rod as a lever. Just pick the best means to an immoral end to see why. For example, if Smith wants to kill Superman, he ought to kill him with kryptonite. Maybe Smith wants or intends to kill Superman, but it doesn't follow that Smith ought to kill Superman with kryptonite or anything else. You shouldn't kill people quite generally. The upshot is that Sellars regiments the scientist's conclusion as Smith raises the object implies Smith uses the rod as a lever, or in Smith's internal monologue, shall, bracket, I raise the object, implies shall, bracket, I use the rod as a lever. In these regimented versions, the want has been transformed into an action or intention. The modality of ought has been packed into the modality of the implies, and we are free of the temptation to apply the ought to the detached consequence. Sellars' purpose in this conceptual excursion is to establish a way for empirical causal connections to be used in practical reasoning with intersubjective validity. And I had this on this slide here. The idea is that the scientist's empirical conclusion, which is true for everyone, can be directly transposed into the hypothetical imperative so that it carries an equivalent status. And the quote, general hypothetical imperatives are simply the transposition into practical discourse of empirical instrumental generalizations. This conclusion, though, is at best misleading. It's not wholly wrong, but I think it's misleading. What the scientists can establish is causal necessity, which for our purposes we can think of as pretty close to alethic necessity. What a hypothetical imperative requires is deontic necessity. These are related by a standard principle of deontic logic that alethic necessity implies deontic necessity. Okay. However, conceptually, the two modalities are distinct, and this will make a difference here in a minute. This matters because it is not just alethic or causal necessity that implies deontic necessity. Suppose Smith consults not just the scientists, but the priests of his tribe, who inform him that because the object is holy and the rod is steel and metal must never touch holy objects, that if he wants to move the object, he absolutely must not use the rod as a lever.
10 minutes, Heath, just to let you know.
Thank you. We can phrase this injunction as, if Smith wants to raise the object, he ought not use the rod as a lever, in a stentorian priestly voice there on the right. So this is another hypothetical imperative, but it's obviously not one that is the transposition into practical discourse of an empirical instrumental generalization. In this case, the deontic necessity of the hypothetical imperative derives from what we might call ceremonial necessity, if I can invent a modality. So empirical science is one source of hypothetical imperatives, but it is not the only possible source. And Sellars has given one story about the authority of hypothetical imperatives, but not the full story. Why the oversight? I can't be sure, but I suspect it has to do again with his implicit consequentialism. If you evaluate choices simply in terms of their results, and you take empirical science to adequately describe the relevant results, then the moral option that Smith's priests embody, namely restrictions on choice that derive from some other source, so that deontic possibility is narrower than causal possibility, that option will be invisible. Let us return to Smith's scientists to explore another avenue of criticism. In the original scenario, they discovered that the lever is the only way to move the heavy object, and they expressed this discovery: if Smith wants to raise the object, he ought to use the rod as a lever. Now, if the lever is the only way to move the object, you should use must there instead of ought. But let's modify the scenario to make H more literally true. Suppose that Smith can move the heavy object simply by bodily lifting it, but at the cost of a hernia. The deontic modalities basically work like this. Must P means that every permissible option includes P. May P means that some permissible option includes P. Ought P means that all the best permissible objects include P. So now we know that if Smith wants to raise the object, he may use the rod as a lever. And if Smith wants to raise the object, he may lift it bodily. But we might plausibly add that if Smith wants to raise the object, he ought to use the rod as a lever. That would be the best option. But to say that using the rod is the best option is to say that it is a better option than bodily lifting the object. Better in what way? Well, using the rod is more mechanically efficient and medically safer. On the other hand, it might not be as psychologically satisfying or ritually correct. Even if we agree that using the rod is a better option for lifting the object than inducing a hernia, this is not a scientific judgment. It's an evaluative one. Now, why is this consequence invisible to Sellars? Part of the reason, perhaps, lies in his picture of practical reasoning. If the structure of practical reasoning has to mirror the structure of theoretical reasoning, then only necessary inferences will be practical inferences at all. Another factor may be, once again, Sellars' implicit consequentialism. A maximizing form of consequentialism will evaluate any set of options and yield only one of them that then must be undertaken. On that picture, many more practical inferences will look necessary than most people with more generous evaluative criteria will think is the case. The upshot is that the authority of hypothetical imperatives cannot be underwritten by the authority of science alone. When there are choices to be made among alternative means, the choice of how to evaluate these alternatives is not a scientific question. Even in the rare case where there's a single causally possible means to some end, there may be more factors to consider than just a scientific question of what is causally possible. And if there are not, that too is an evaluative judgment. We've said, okay, the values are wide open in this case. The modality of hypothetical imperatives is a deontic one, and there really is no escape from the need for a form of deontic authority to underwrite them. All right. So sorry, I should have put this slide up earlier. So Sellars has a story about how we get from causal to deontic necessity, but often we're not interested in just necessity. We're interested in, what's best. And I think some of this is trackable to, again, that sort of consequentialist, science-friendly viewpoint he starts from. All right. So let me sum up. Sellars and Anscombe are in fundamental agreement that intentions can be reasoned about. Exactly how is more disputed. Sellars draws the intention belief distinction more sharply than Anscombe, and unlike her, he holds that expressions of intention have no truth values. Anscombe, I believe, has a solid set of arguments here. Seeing things her way allows us to avoid both awkward syntax and representing intentions and implausible claims about non-compositionality when it comes to expressions of intention. Furthermore, I believe Anscombe sees the structure of practical reasoning more clearly than Sellars does. Sellars' mistakes on this head lead to the erasure of some morally important concepts and a misrepresentation of what makes for good practical inferences. Anscombe's view, in contrast, preserves more common sense on both accounts. These errors, I believe, stem at least partly from the consequentialism, which Sellars reveals only toward the end of his various publications. I suggest, however, that his consequentialism is operative much earlier in the practical inferences he recognizes and in his view about the contents of intentions. The same commitment to consequentialism leads to his failure of his argument for the intersubjective validity of hypothetical imperatives. I shouldn't say failure, the incompleteness of that argument. I do not believe Sellars' work on practical topics is valueless. I've given it some criticism here, but in particular, I've not said anything about we intentions, which is Sellars' most distinctive contribution in this area, and I think a promising one. But the Anscombean critique of Sellars' practical philosophy reveals significant cracks in its foundation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Heath. So now we have time for questions. I think are these clapping? Jeremy looks like clapping. Yeah, okay. Ronald.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Heath. I really enjoyed that paper, and I'm myself, I have thought not very deeply about Sellars' attempt to give an account of practical reasoning, but so I find much of your critique convincing. I would, however, like to ask a question regarding your reconstruction of Anscombe's view, and in particular, this, if I understood, this piece of practical reasoning about good fiction. So first premise, I guess it's a premise, I will read some good fiction. Second, gravity's rainbow is good fiction, therefore I will read gravity's rainbow. And if I understood, that's a good piece of reasoning according to Anscombe, not a good piece of deductive reasoning, but a good piece of means-end reasoning.
Yes.
But we can run parallel arguments. I will read some good fiction. Now that is an expression of intention, as I understand it, in Anscombe's sense, right? Yeah. And the conclusion is also an expression of intention. I will read gravity's rainbow. Mm-hmm. So, well, if we just vary the second premise and the conclusion accordingly, so I will read Brothers Karamazov is a piece of good fiction. So I will read Brothers Karamazov. Third, Song of Solomon is a piece of great fiction. Therefore, I will read Song of Solomon. So is she saying that all of those are good pieces of practical reasoning with a conclusion, each expressing an intention? Surely I'm not intending to read all that stuff.
Yeah, no, exactly. So you're not. Presumably you couldn't, that particular argument is, you're reasoning from a general end to some specific conclusion, right? Which has the same kind of logical structure as I've got some, I've got lots of things I could do. I got to teach an epistemology class. I got to put together a syllabus. This is a pretty good syllabus, so I'll do this one. There are any number of syllabi I could put together, right? And so, but obviously I'm not going to create an infinite number of syllabi. So I think what Anscombe was going to want to say is that, look, this is a means to my, or it's an instance of the goal I want to accomplish, all right? There are any number of ways I could do it, all of which would be good reasoning. If we could look at maybe the length of the books, or if they're in my area of interest, that might affect how you think about it. But the fact that I choose this particular argument to reason with, or the fact that I arrive at this conclusion, this specific conclusion, doesn't mean that I am rationally required to accept all the logically parallel conclusions, right? I don't, just because I'm committed to reading Gravity's Rainbow doesn't mean I'm committed to reading Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick or whatever. So I think the view would be, look, all of those would be decent pieces of practical reasoning if I went into them, but I don't have to do that. I think that's Anscombe's position.
Quick follow-up then. So this conclusion, how much hangs on it that it is an expression of intention? Because she can't really say that it's an expression of intention, right? Otherwise, I would intend to read all these books, but I don't. So is there a way to deny that the conclusion is an expression of intention without doing too much damage to the rest of her way of reconstructing means-ends reasoning?
No, I think what's going on here is, if you start with the model of logic, deductive validity, then the premises demand a particular conclusion. You know, if you accept these premises, you're required to get to this conclusion. And Anscombe just says that's not the way practical reasoning works. So in fact, I might intend to read Gravity's Rainbow because it's a way of read serious fiction. And that follows from the premises I started with, but I'm not required. It's not necessary given those premises, and I'm not required to also intend everything that would also follow from those premises.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, if there are no questions right now, then let me jump in here. Can I ask you, Heath, why should Sellars have to think that contemplative reasoning is only deductive? You know, he makes this case about material inferences and inference and meaning, and he thinks of them as being expressed by subjunctive conditionals, and subjunctives don't obey antecedent strengthening, so that means the material inferences are defeasible, right?
Yes.
If it were to rain, then I would get wet, but if it were to rain and I carried an umbrella, then I wouldn't get wet. So in the meta language, that's to say the inference is defeasible, and so it's not deductive. So was there a reason to think that Sellars had to think that, because that would be a way of trying from within the Sellarsian perspective to say that the two kinds of reasoning are on
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, Preston, and it's an oversimplification in my paper, which I will fix, okay? No, Sellars needn't be committed to, you know, deductive necessity as the only form of reasoning. However, I think that doesn't actually help too much, and I tried to address that in the paper, right? There's a lot of theoretical reasoning is in fact non-deductive. You're right, okay? But again, practical reasoning is, according to Anscombe, is like the reverse of theoretical reasoning. So for example, if I intend to keep reading serious fiction, this is an attractive piece of serious fiction, Gravity's Rainbow. Hey, I'll read that, okay? Now, that's finding a specific conclusion to a general end, okay, which is upside down from the theoretical piece of reasoning, right? The theoretical reasoning would be, here I am reading Gravity's Rainbow, it's a piece of serious fiction, therefore I'm reading serious fiction, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think if you just keep in mind that what Anscombe says is like, look, when you're theoretically reasoning, you're trying to discover truths, and maybe some of that is probabilistic and some of it is therefore non-deductive or whatever. But when you're practically reasoning, you're trying to create truths. And so some of that reasoning might be probabilistic too, but it's not probabilistic in the same way that the theoretical reasoning is, right? You're trying to make things happen. And so that just puts a whole different structure on what's going to count as good reasoning.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, Ronald, I take it your hand can go down, or are you jumping back in?
No, it can definitely go down, sorry.
No.
Stephanie, by the way, also has a question.
Oh, I didn't see. Oh, sorry. Stephanie, please.
Yeah, somehow hand raising is not working for me, so I just write in the chat when I have a question. Thanks for the talk. I found that really enlightening. And I agree with a number of things on you, especially this idea or this role of science that Sellars has for practical reasoning. That always struck me as like overrated. And just by the way, that team of scientists that assist Smith, this team includes students of the guards for Sellars. He explicitly writes that, so maybe that changes something. Maybe these ritual considerations come into view, but maybe not. Yeah. In any case, I have two questions, and the first is you said that for Anscombe, whether I express an intention or a belief with through I will do A, for example, that depends on the reasons that I have for that statement, say. Yeah, but Sellars, as an inferentialist, wouldn't view this as extrinsic. Yeah, as an inferentialist, he would say what reasons support this attitude or the belief that is important for the content. Yeah.
Yes.
So I just want to ask what your thoughts are about that. And then the second point, you wanted to say that it would be good for Sellars if he could view these statements like I will do A as indeterminate between expressing beliefs and intentions. That would give him more flexibility. Yeah, that was something you wanted to say, I think. But I wasn't quite convinced by the examples. Where you wanted to say, yeah, these are really indeterminate between expressing a belief and expressing an intention. You had this mortgage example there and the Mars example. Yeah, there I had the feeling that these were quite, we do not know anything about the context in which you make these statements. Yeah, and that the context would probably contribute a lot to disambiguating what is expressed, an intention or a belief. So as long as we do not know anything about the context, it's not quite convincing to say that these are really indeterminate. And similarly for the doctor example and the nurse example, I know that Sellars does not work with these tools in pragmatics, but still maybe, I think we can maybe rally them for defending him here a bit. In the doctor example, I think you could argue that the doctor, when he utters, nurse will take you to ward, I don't know, then by uttering, say, but by this one utterance, the doctor makes two different speech acts because he has two addressees there, the nurse and the patient, and these two addressees have two different social roles, and that would enable the doctor to make two different speech acts by that one utterance. But if there was only one of these addressees, then it would be determined which of the speech acts he actually makes, if it's the expression of an intention or a request, or whether it's just a statement concerning how the future will be. Yeah, so isn't that like, again, a question which turns on the pragmatics of that situation? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, very sharp question, Stephanie. Thank you very much. So here's on the first one, you said, look, Sellars is an inferentialist. So if we've got different kinds of reasoning leading us to this what looks on the surface like the same content, shouldn't he, as a consistent inferentialist, shouldn't he have reason to hold that these are in fact two different contents? Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. In fact, I thought about that, and I didn't quite have space to look at it in this paper because it's a pretty subtle point. But I think, yeah, that's a good reply on Sellars' behalf. But frankly, I think that it's a problem for inferentialism. Because I think Anscombe has a pretty good case that the truth conditions of a statement don't change. You know, if I say, if some student says, I will fail the exam tomorrow, and student A says that because don't know the material, and student B says, because I'm trying to piss off my parents, they're both, in some important sense, saying the same thing. The truth conditions are the same. And you can disagree with them in the same way, and they contradict the same other claims, and so on. So, yeah, I think you could make a case that inferentialism would deliver different contents. But if you did make that case, I guess I think that would be so much the worse for inferentialism. Maybe you could, I don't know. That's how I'm thinking about it right now. I'm not sure that's true, but maybe. So the second question you said, well, look, if we knew more about the context of these claims, we could tell whether they were an expression of intention or an expression of belief. So what I tried to do with is come up with situations where either both theoretical and practical reasons apply, or neither theoretical and practical reasons apply. So I think the both case is the clearest, right? So I have this mortgage. I owe a lot of money on this house, but you know, in 20 years, it'll be paid off. That's very predictable given the way my finances are set up. On the other hand, I also think it's a great idea, right? So when I say I'll pay off my mortgage before I retire, that has a very clear truth value. You know, I'm going to get to my retirement date and either my mortgage is paid off or not. On the other hand, it seems to me that there's a lot of reasons on the theoretical side, a lot of reasons on the practical side to believe that statement or to assent to it or concur with it. And, you know, you have a couple of options here. You can say there's two things, a belief and an intention back there, and somehow they're both expressing into this one statement. Or I think what Anscombe's going to say, look, you have one mental state, the content of which is I will pay off my mortgage before I retire. And it's got two different kinds of reasons behind it. And that's all you got to say. And let me just, another thing you mentioned was the doctor-nurse example. And so let me just be slightly more clear about where I was trying to go with that example and what I think Anscombe's trying to say. Little detour, Austin mentions in some place when he's talking about performatives, what he calls the sacramental fallacy. The idea that there's this inner state which I am expressing when I say, I promise to meet you for coffee or whatever. And Austin pours cold water on that. He says, look, whether you make a performative or not has to do with the social context. It doesn't have anything really to do with your mental state. Maybe you're lying, maybe you're being deceptive, maybe you don't even know what you're saying, but you made a promise, and that's a social fact. And I think Anscombe is resisting a similar picture from Sellars, that there's this internal state, intention or belief, and there's this real sharp distinction between the two, one of which is the source, or the gets expressed in a statement. And Anscombe's view is, look, the meaning of the statement, the content of the statement, the content of the state, it is what it is. It's a social fact that has a truth value. And which state it is simply determined by its position in a state of theoretical practical reasons, not some kind of intrinsic difference. I don't know if that's a full answer to your questions. They were very good, but that's the best I can do for now.
Yep, thank you.
Jeremy?
I'll just keep it quick. I mean, I would say that I'm semi-sympathetic to your argument. I mean, SM clearly requires that you intend all the consequences of your intentions, and so as it stands, it's clearly unacceptable. I mean, Sellars is pretty clear that means-end reasoning means finding necessary conditions for the satisfaction of your ends, which is not at all how practical reasoning works. So he's just wrong. I mean, he's clearly just wrong about that. I guess I'm more optimistic that this stuff can be fixed. I think SM can be, yoked to an intentional with an S logic. I've written tiresome length about this, so I won't talk about it now. As Preston said, I think there's this idea of material practical inference that kind of parallels the theoretical inference that can be brought into service too. So I mean, I think the account can be patched up. But I had a specific question. I think that there are actually some bits of Sellars machinery that makes good sense of at least some of the examples you give. So for example, I will run a marathon and be sick example. You mentioned in this context, so be it. I think that's an example where so be it actually makes a ton of sense, actually, because you use so be it to get those factual premises within the scope of the operator. And Sellars says, well, you need to do that in order to take these factual things into account in practical reasoning. And on reasoning about value, he says, shall be, shall I will go downtown and invite Jones and be happy, or shall I will go downtown and not invite Jones and not be happy? And obviously, some of these are things that he intends, and some of these things are merely consequences of things that he would be intending and doing. But putting the consequences of the things you intend inside the scope of the shall operator is an essential part of practical reasoning. And so I think that so be it actually helps make good sense of those kinds of sentences where you have like something that's the object of an intention and something that is something that you predict or foresee or that you're making a factual assertion about. So I actually think Sellars actually has a really good story about stuff like that.
Okay, let me just think about this. Maybe you're right here. My point. Okay, so what you want to say, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that look, I might have an intention to run a marathon and a prediction that I will afterwards be sick, and I can use so be it to combine those in a kind of conjunction so that I have the compound intention to run a marathon and be sick. Is that what you want to say?
I mean, that's certainly what Sellars says. And then, you might think, oh, I could run a marathon and be sick, or I could not run a marathon and not be sick. And those are your options in practical reasoning. And that's how so be it gets those factual premises into the scope of the shall, and that's how practical reasoning works.
All right. So I guess the first thing I want to say is actually that's not going to be the content of an intention. I don't I can predict I'm going to get sick, but it's not my intention. But I think what I was getting at earlier was a point about just semantics, not so much inference, but semantics, right? If I have so maybe so be it solves this. What I wanted to say was that we don't have a good semantics for the conjunction, but if you use the so be it thing, maybe we can just use that. Is that that might work actually.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got about 6 minutes and at least 2 more questions. So Zachary.
All right, thanks for a really interesting talk. So I want to go back to the case of the intention cum belief to pay off your mortgage on time that you think Anscombe's account treats favorably as compared to Sellars' account. So I recall you just saying in response to a question that it's sort of a virtue of the Anscombean account as opposed to the Sellarsian account that it doesn't require that any statement like this, which can be interpreted as both an expression of belief and an expression of intention, expresses just one kind of inner state that has a sort of intrinsic characteristic that makes it have one of these forces or the other. It occurred to me that maybe in response to that, Sellers's functionalism could help him out in this respect. Because of course, like for Sellars, the characteristics of a mental state that make it an intention or a belief aren't intrinsic, strictly speaking. They're sort of functional characteristics. And isn't it possible that a certain state of which the expression, right, I'll pay off my mortgage on time could be, as it were, doing double duty, could have two jobs in your cognitive economy, one of which is to do the kinds of things that beliefs do, which is to figure in good inferences that help you figure out what's going on and to adapt you to circumstances so that you sort of cope rationally with them. And also the job of bringing it about that you pay off your mortgage on time. I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah, no, I
That
think
suggestion and
I
so
think
on.
actually Anscombe would be very friendly to that.
Uh-huh.
I mean, in effect, she says, look, whether it's an intention or a belief has to do with the kind of reasons behind it. So that's basically a functional approach. And I think the reason Sellars can't do that is because he wants to say expressions of intention and expressions of belief have different, and the other one doesn't.
Sorry,
So,
you cut out right in the crucial bit there,
sorry.
or at least for me.
I think Anscombe would be very friendly to the suggestion you just made. She has basically a functionalist account of the relevant mental states. But I think the reason Sellars can't do that is because he wants to say categorically different things about intentions and beliefs, or expressions of intention and expressions of belief. Expressions of intentions don't have a truth value. Expressions of belief do.
Yeah.
So which is it? I think that's the problem.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Kyle?
Thanks, Preston. And thank you, Heath, for a great paper, so much to think about. I wanted to ask about the section with the lever lifter and the academy who are consulting him. And I'm sorry if I'm misstating your claim there, but the way I took it was that you're saying Sellars' account of practical reasoning is impoverished because it doesn't give, because for one reason, it doesn't give us deontic necessity. But in the cases we're thinking about, we're not talking about the right kind of intentions. So we intentions or the intentions that are derived from them. So I always thought like the deontic character is inherited from the universalizability or the intersubjective form of we intentions. But in the cases we're looking at, we're not looking, it's just not the right kind of intention. So can't we get the deontic necessity once we import the right kind of intentions?
Well, I mean, Sellars runs this little argument. He runs this little scenario with Smith in a couple of his papers with small differences.
Yes.
And what he's trying to do is just talk about hypothetical imperatives. And, like, you've got this big object and there's only one way to move it, right? And so it looks like the scientist can tell you, look, this thing's only going to get moved with this big lever, right? But how do you get from that empirical claim to the thing that you can use in practical reasoning, which is if you want to move this object, then you must use this big lever, right? And as soon as you put the must in there, there's a modality, and it's a you gotta, which is not exactly what the scientist came up with. And I think that the story he tells about the scientist is basically right. I mean, if there's only one way to move it, then we could say, if you're going to move it, then you gotta use the lever. So I didn't want to argue that that was like wrong, but it is a step from the claim about the causal space to the claim about the deontic, or if you prefer, prudential space, right? That modality. And there's other ways to get there, right? It could be that there's only one causal way to do things, but there's other modalities that we respect too. And I mentioned ceremony, but it could be etiquette, right? There's only one way to handle some situation politely. And you can imagine hypothetical imperatives based on that. So my point is not that he's like making big mistakes in what he does say, but that he doesn't give you the whole picture. And as far as the we intentions, he sort of explicitly leaves that for like another section of the papers. This is really about hypothetical imperatives.